I know, that's true. But I can guarantee one thing he's saying right now. Y'all come on anytime. So tonight we're not going to look very, very long because quite frankly, I'm getting tired. I know y'all are too, and we still have deacons meeting, so I don't want to be very, very long tonight, but we'll look at this sub-chapter on pages 87 through 89. Jack in the Box. Have y'all read this sub-chapter yet? I know Bear Joe has. Did you see the...
remember what I read because I didn't read it today.
The reason why he titled it Jack in the Box. Do y'all remember that if you read it already?
No, sorry.
Because it's the idea of something's coming and you're anxious over what's coming. And he talks about that on page 88. And I like how he says in there something about, I can look at it and tell you. He says, on a side note, why did anyone think that a terror in a box would make a good toy for toddlers? I saw something on TV one time. This lady was refurbishing some toys for some kind of charity. And she was playing with a Jack in the Box, and it popped out. She said, well, good night. If I looked that ugly, I'd hide in the box too. But anyway, he begins this sub-chapter with the reminder of the statement that his friend had made when he felt led to start a church. God will break you. I like how he calls it here, the boldest promise I never wanted to hear. Now, the paragraph under that, I think is very, very good. He says, he was so confident in his prophetic statement that I never doubted him. Not only was he confident that God would eventually break me, but he was even more confident that God would use it. So notice that right there. He is confident that God would break him, but he was also confident that God would use that breaking. And we've talked about that a whole lot about in the brokenness that we have experienced at different points in life. And if we can look back on it and see how God used it in our life to be that source where we bring him glory through our life. He says, the breaking would make me better. It would sharpen my leadership, deepen my faith, increase my intimacy with Jesus. So thinking back on that idea of we can probably look back and we can see different times of brokenness, and prayerfully we trusted God through it, and we can see the end of it and see how God has used that for our betterment, we'll call it. Not only the increased intimacy or sharpening leadership, but how about that idea of deepening my faith? So think about Job, and Job, he was broken if anybody ever was broken. But you notice all through the book of Job how he uses his faith in each and every instance. Even when people are telling him, basically, Job, God hates you. Why are you letting this happen? Why don't you just curse God and die? Job's wife says. But Job continues to use that faith. And we see at the end how that benefited him and how God got the glory. That's how did God get the glory? Job endured all these difficulties. He endured all these, we'll call them arrows from Satan. But never once did he curse God. Never once was he anything but a positive witness for God and for God's glory. And that's exactly what we need to be focused on when we're thinking of this idea of breaking. It needs to be something to make us better, deepen our faith, increase that time that we have with God, that intimacy with God through Jesus Christ. I like what he says in the following paragraph. One of the most dangerous prayers anyone could pray. God, I trust you so much. I know that you love me, that you are always working in me. If you want to do something more in me, then do it. That's faith right there, ain't it? If it's painful, then I welcome the pain. Not many of us be willing to say that too often. If it's painful, then I welcome the pain. If you want to use trials to make me stronger, build my faith, make me closer to you, then use them. Now here's the poignant part right here. God, do whatever it takes to free me from my love for the world, to crucify my love of comfort. And as I was reading that, I got to thinking about Matthew chapter 26, and it's Jesus in the garden, actually, when he's praying just before that time of crucifixion. And this isn't new territory for any of us, but in Matthew chapter 26, verses 38 and 39, then saith he unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry here and watch with me. What's he doing? He's talking to the disciples that are with him there in the garden. In verse 39, and he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. So let me ask us all a question. How often are we willing to say, God, do your will in my life? We say it a lot when we're in a time of corporate prayer, God, have your will in your way. But in our own personal prayer life, how often are we ready to turn loose the reins and say, God, have your will? And that's something that we really need to get a handle on. I'm not an expert at it by any means whatsoever, but we have to come to those times when we realize that God's will is more important than our will. Perfect case in point, what Jesus said right here. Not as I will, but as you will. And what was God's will? For Christ to fulfill his mission, to go to the cross, to pay the sin debt for each and every one of us. That was God's will. And Jesus says, God, have your will, not my will. We get into our comfort zone. We get into our status quo we've talked about in another sub-chapter. And sometimes we think that our will is God's will, don't we? And, sometimes it might feel like something is God's will and not our will. But 9 times out of 10, I believe if we were honest with ourselves and with God, our prayers for God to have his will and his way in our own personal prayer life, in our own personal walk of faith, we might not necessarily say it all that often. Just like we don't often say, break me. But we definitely need to, because we know that God is going to produce wonderful things through that, but it's not pleasant, and that's why we don't like it. It don't feel good, and that's why we don't want to say it. And this guy that wrote this book here, so imagine him, he's excited about building this church, and he just knows that it's God's will for his life. How do you, he said it in here, but it's kind of hard to look at words printed on paper and kind of feel what somebody's feeling. But what do you think he felt when that guy said, God's going to break you?
Oh, low, as far as, like something's kicked out from under it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a feeling like, well, that's a terrible thing to say. I'm wanting to do God's will here.
Or another example would be knock the breath out of you.
Yeah. Kind of take the wind out of the sails.
There you go.
Yeah.
Use that. That's a good example.
And you can empathize with that, because that's exactly how we would feel.
Right.
If we felt like that God just had this plan for us, and then to have somebody say, God is going to break you in this process, it would take the wind out of our sails. But it's what had to happen. So look on page 88 here, and he'll give kind of a synopsis. He says, although God doesn't say yes to all of my prayers, somehow I knew he was likely to answer this one. That's a good statement, isn't it? See, God answers all our prayers. He don't always say yes to all our prayers, but I tend to agree with the author that God will likely say yes to that prayer. So believing the breaking would come, I braced myself. Surely it would happen now, today. If not today, then tomorrow. Soon God would break me. Yeah, that's it. Though I trusted him every day, I waited and wondered, would it be okay? And then comes that suspense and that dread that he talks about with the Jack in the Box. And to think about it, those are a terrifying thing. I never have liked them. But yeah, you know it's coming, and you're just at the edge of your seat. Well, let me think of another way I can describe that. Have you ever watched a movie, and maybe you've watched it many, many times, but there's some kind of exciting climax to it, and you know it's coming, but you're always so anxious when it gets closer and closer to that point. Did y'all ever see the new Top Gun last year? Good movie. But you know what? Every time I see it, I get anxious when they launch off that carrier for that mission.
But another example, if you had a firecracker, you light it and you throw it, and you see the fuse, you think it's out, and you stand up, boom, all of a sudden you have that jolt, and it scares you.
Yeah. Or when your older brother is waiting in the other room and you don't know he's there, and
Oh, yeah.
that's happened. But that he knows that God's going to break him. He knows it's going to happen, and he's at the edge of his seat, just waiting to see what's going to happen. But then look at the bottom of page 88 there. He says, I heard that starting a church was difficult. Everyone who told me that was correct. Even though we experienced so many good things, blessings, and lives changed, the pain of the wait, the hard work, and the sacrifices often felt unbearable. So here goes some breaking. A few months in, the church lost the facility they were renting. Next thing, a news reporter wrote a scathing article about the author that questioned his motives and created rumors and gossip that hurt his family. More breaking. The workload was crushing, the hours grueling, the burden overwhelming. More breaking. Leadership mistakes that hurt people, close friends getting mad and leaving the church, having to let people go. One being a friend, one being a family member. More breaking. But then what does he say? He says, I called his friend Gary and asked him, am I broken yet? Look at that though. Gary told him, not yet. He was very prophetic, wasn't he? And he says, when you're broken, you're going to know it. There'll be no question. You're not going to have to ask. Think about that right there. Have we ever been through some kind of testing, some kind of season of a valley, and we wonder, God, have you finally finished with me? But it just keeps coming, doesn't it? I mean, you name it. It can be health difficulties. It can be work difficulties, financial difficulties, family difficulties. You know, you name it, it can happen. And we all wonder, how much longer, Lord? David wondered that.
A death of a loved one, even if you're waiting for it,
Yeah.
it still breaks you.
Oh, yes.
And you're waiting, just like they said. We know it's gonna happen.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know when.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still as big a heartbreak when it happens as
Right.
if when you thought it was gonna happen. And that's the thing that I thought of when I read it. I said, everyone about all of us here has lost a close loved one, parent, grandparent, or something. And I don't know of anything any more devastating than, because you're helpless and
Yeah.
you're helpless. Can't do nothing.
You have two thoughts about that. One, hopefully they'll survive. Then the other, you say, well, Lord, when you gonna come? You know, and you got two different scenarios there. You You're pulling and pushing, I call it.
And you know for a fact one of the others coming, it's
Right.
pretty soon, usually when you get to that point of thinking. And you're helpless.
Yeah. And then that anxiety is right there.
Oh, yeah.
And I know there are things worse, but there's definitely that anxiety and waiting on something like that's way high up on the worst meter, if you ask me, because you just don't know. It's a whole lot easier if, you know, something will just happen when you think it's supposed to, and then that'd be the end of it, but it just don't work that way. But we know it's got to happen.
It's not your time, it's the Lord's time.
That's right. That's right. God's clock ain't the same as ours.
Nope.
So here's the takeaway from this subchapter. We, first of all, need to be willing to ask God to break us. We've been saying that all along. But second, we need to realize the breaking, it might come quick or not so quick. Might come once where it may be drawn out. Come all at once, but be drawn out. But we need to be ready. Let me read my handwriting. And know it will be for God's glory in us. I think that's one of the hardest parts right there. Even though we believe in God, we're saved, we know Jesus Christ, we know that God's got us, we're always so in the dark about His glory being manifest in us. But we've been saying it all along, the only way His glory is going to be manifested in us is if we follow Him like we need to and be willing to pray these dangerous prayers. Number one, search me. Number two, break me. Because He's got to get the glory. And we got to understand that. But it's not fun going through it. And it's definitely not fun sitting there and waiting for something. But all in the end, we must know that it's all for God's glory. I hadn't read no further in the book, so I don't know exactly how it turned out. A lot of times folks will read the end and see how it turns out. I hadn't done that.
I ain't gonna tell you.
Okay. I can be on the edge of my seat waiting
But
on
I've been
that
a
part.
while since I read it, so I need to start again and get on back.
But the whole point of the matter is, you know, yes, it's anxious time waiting on all of that when we make that prayer, because we know it's going to happen. But we need to be ready for it to happen because we asked for it, and we got to understand that it's going to bring God glory once we are broken. Because we're stubborn is what it is. That's why sometimes we go through so many different levels of broke until we get there. And I think that was probably the author's problem too. He was stubborn, and so he had to go through so many levels of break before he gets there. But in any case, that's where I'm gonna break contact on this tonight, because it was a short sub-chapter anyway. Sometimes I like the short ones. But has anybody got anything else to add?
Well, you're talking about death, you know, sometimes it's instant, you know, unexpected, and that's a shock to you. And then the other is that longevity, just waiting and waiting, and saying when's it going to happen, and then when you turn your back, it happens.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's just the way it is a lot of times.
Yeah, it's a perfect illustration for what we're talking about, that's for sure.
The comforting part is where he tells us that he'll never leave us or forsake us.
Amen.
And if we're Christians, we got that to lean on every circumstance. That should be the first thing we think about when bad things or whatever.
Yeah,
We consider bad things or hardships and whatever, but he's going to be there with us regardless.
that's right. Sometimes it's hard for us to see that in the heat of the battle, as it were, but
Yeah. Think of, why'd you do this to me if you're going to be there with me waiting? Are you enjoying watching me suffer?
yeah. But you know what? I don't know
This is we're normal people.
how many of y'all saw today's devotion, but Psalm chapter 27 and verse 14, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. So that speaks right to it. All right. Anybody else got any questions or comments or anything on that? All right. If not, I'll go ahead and this thing